Thank you. I would now like to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. David Cooper, Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Previously, in the Secretariat of the Convention, David served as Director, Division for Science, Assessment and Monitoring, where he led work to promote the implementation of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-20 and National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. Dr. Cooper will address the summit on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Dr. Cooper.
Alison Johnston, Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament, Juan Carlos Villalonga, President of Globe International, Honourable Legislators, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Globe International for the kind invitation to address this summit, to share with you progress on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity, to discuss synergies between the CBD COP15 and the COP26 underway in Glasgow, and to explore with you how parliamentarians, how legislators can help to ensure that the negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity lead to a strong framework and then its effective implementation. It's a particular pleasure to be with you, as there has been a long-standing cooperation between the Convention on Biological Diversity and Globe, notably through a Globe Forum organised at the 10th meeting of the COP in Nagoya in 2010. And this helped to ensure that the role of parliamentarians was recognised and enshrined in the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020. And in a similar forum in Cancun, Mexico, in 2016, which helped to promote mainstreaming of biodiversity across various sectors. I'd also like to thank the presiding officer and members of the Scottish Parliament for welcoming us and hosting us in this magnificent debating chamber. Ladies and gentlemen, humanity stands at a crossroads. The crises of biodiversity loss and climate change pose an existential threat to our society, to our cultures, our prosperity, and our planet. For both issues, biodiversity and climate, urgent action this decade is imperative. And these two issues are very much intertwined. In fact, they're really two aspects of a broader single issue. Climate change is a major driver of biodiversity loss, with impacts visible already. It's therefore imperative that we limit climate change as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. We now know, in fact, that impacts for biodiversity, and therefore for the contributions to ecosystem services that are essential to sustainable development, that those impacts at 2 degrees would be at least twice as bad as those impacts at 1.5, and of course at higher levels, much more so. Every degree matters, every fraction of a degree matters. At the same time, we also know that efforts to protect and restore biodiversity and improve our management of ecosystems can and should be major contributions to climate action, both mitigation and adaptation. This can be through protecting and restoring forests, grasslands, wetlands, and marine ecosystems, and so on, and also through better management of our agricultural pastures and rangelands. This is essential not only in storing carbon to mitigate climate change, but protecting us against coastal against extreme weather events in coastal systems, for example. Therefore, I'd like to very much welcome the focus on nature at COP26. And I'd like to pay tribute to the UK presidency team for its efforts in this regard. We've heard at COP26 important commitments made by governments, by civil society, by multilateral development banks, and by public and private institutions, including financial institutions. We see a move by many countries and institutions to increase the allocation of climate finance towards ecosystem-based approaches that I've just described, or nature-based solutions, to increase these up to about a third. Previously, only about 3% of climate finance was devoted to these channels, whereas we know they have the potential to contribute around 30% of the solution. But as we pursue such ecosystem-based approaches, such nature-based solutions to climate change, we must always take care on a number of fronts. Firstly, such approaches must be implemented with Indigenous peoples and local communities in the driving seat, respecting their rights. And we have to be aware of competing demands for land. Secondly, we must be ecologically literate. Planting trees everywhere is not the answer. Reducing deforestation and promoting forest restoration is essential, but ecosystems beyond forests have important roles too. The peatlands in the uplands in Scotland and other upland parts of Britain are critical and clear examples of this. Moreover, ecosystems have value beyond carbon, and the multiple and diverse values of nature and its contributions to people must be considered. Thirdly, nature-based solutions must be in addition to strong reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. They must not replace such strong action or merely offset continued emissions. We need to do everything. We need to do both things in order to get close to 1.5 degrees. And finally, we must be aware that if we don't act urgently and simultaneously to reduce climate change and other drivers of biodiversity loss, the very ecosystems we need to use to be part of the solution will lose their resilience and their potential contribution will be lost. So these considerations should really push us to double down on 1.5 degrees. We've seen in recent months and days encouraging progress, in particular with respect to long-term goals for 2050 and beyond, which do have the potential, as analysis published in the last few days show, to allow us to stay below 2 degrees. But we need to get to 1.5, and critically, we need to see more concrete, short-term commitments for action during this decade to 2030. And hopefully, further commitments made now at COP26 in Glasgow and next year in COP15 in Kunming will ensure that we avoid this vicious cycle and instead create a virtuous one. Ladies and gentlemen, last month, COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity opened in Kunming, China. In the Kunming Declaration, agreed at the high-level ministerial segment, ministers committed themselves to ensure the development, the adoption, and the implementation of an effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework, one that reverses the current loss of biodiversity and ensures that biodiversity is put on a path to recovery by 2030 at the latest, towards the full realization of the longer-term goal, the 2050 vision, of living in harmony with nature. The framework is due to be adopted at the second part of COP15 in April-May next year, also in Kunming. Sitting alongside the Paris Agreement, it will serve as the UN's common approach on biodiversity for this decade, with clear goals for 2050 and a set of targets for the ambitious yet feasible actions needed by 2030 to achieve those goals. And negotiators are also preparing a set of complementary decisions to support the implementation of the framework, including approaches to resource mobilization, mainstreaming, capacity building, and monitoring and reporting. The Kunming Declaration itself and statements made by individual countries and organizations at the first part of COP15 has given us clear political direction for the negotiation of the framework and provided some important initiatives to ensure that, once adopted, it will be quickly implemented. We cannot afford the delays we experienced 10 years ago after Nagoya. For example, the host country, China, announced the establishment of the Kunming Biodiversity Fund to support parties in implementing the outcomes of COP15, while Japan extended the fund it had established in 2010. The GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, together with the United Nations Development Programme and the United Nations Environment Programme, assured countries that resources would be in place from day one to translate the new framework into national targets and action. Furthermore, the European Union and the UK announced major increases in funding for biodiversity. We also saw financial institutions with assets of over 12 million euros committed to nature-positive action. These are all welcome contributions, but more will be needed. Clearly, achieving the ambitious goals and targets of the new framework, reversing biodiversity loss before 2030, will require transformative change across all sectors of the economy and across all parts of society. And you, legislators, parliamentarians, have crucial and multiple roles to play in this regard. Firstly, parliamentarians can advocate for a strong and effective framework, ensuring that the negotiators deliver on the political promises made in Kunming and in Glasgow. Secondly, parliamentarians can call for the development of inclusive and effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans, translating the global targets into national targets that are commensurate with those global targets, and ensuring a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach. Also ensuring that we have coherent action on climate change and on biodiversity. Thirdly, parliamentarians, of course, will develop and approve the legislation necessary to implement the framework. This can include keystone enabling legislation that ensures that commitments made by one administration are carried over and respected by the next. Some notable examples of legislation include the biodiversity laws of Costa Rica, Japan and Norway, marine legislation in Namibia, forest legislation in Rwanda, and of course the UK's Climate Act. And we eagerly anticipate the approval of the UK Environment Bill shortly. Fourthly, parliamentarians can ensure that the necessary budgetary provisions are made so that the actions to implement the framework are properly resourced. Equally, they can scrutinise other expenditures with the aim of eliminating harmful subsidies. Currently, we invest orders of magnitude more resources in destroying biodiversity than in protecting it. And finally, parliamentarians can oversee a transparent reporting and review process, holding the executive to account to ensure that strategies, plans and policies are implemented. And I'd like to highlight the importance of considering different levels of governance, from global to regional, from national to sub-national, including urban and local. It was indeed a Scottish biologist and urban planner, Patrick Geddes, who promoted the idea of think globally, act locally over 100 years ago. And in this context, here in Edinburgh, I'd like to pay tribute to the Government of Scotland for having led the Edinburgh process for subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I would also like to underline the critical importance of sharing of knowledge and experience among legislators across countries and regions. There's a lot we can learn from each other on what works and what doesn't. And I'd highlight the role of this forum, GLOBE, in this regard. GLOBE has already contributed to learning among countries on both climate change and biodiversity, but as always, there's a potential for an enhanced role in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, as we develop and finalise the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we will look to GLOBE and we'll look to your constituency, legislators and parliamentarians, to continue to champion action on biodiversity and on climate change in a coherent way, to help create the political capital needed to ensure the effectiveness of our policy measures and their implementation. We look to legislators to hold governments to account, to ensure that the commitments made are respected and further strengthened commensurate with the challenges that we face, and that they're translated into concrete policies and actions. Surely we must seize this opportunity of COP26 and COP15 to make sure that action is taken this decade to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees and to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, putting us on a path to sustainable development and living in harmony with nature. In the words of Sir David Attenborough, what we do now and in the next few years will profoundly affect the next few thousand years. I thank you.